Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Welcome, one and all. It's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you with us, and both of us are back on glorious American soil. Week 0 kicks off this weekend, so it is time for us to make our big picks of the preseason. Who will make the playoff, who will make the final, and who will win some of the major college football awards when all is said and done. Shehan and I will make our calls. Who will be right, who will be wrong, and who will get irate fans of various universities heckling them in replies. Listen in and find out for yourself. But before we dive in, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Take a moment, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. But, Shehan, how are you today?
I'm good. It's it feels like the season's actually starting now, mostly because I'm starting to get that real wave of like radio requests and setting up interviews and all this sort of stuff. I actually just jumped off of one with my local Dallas radio station, which that one's always a fun one. But like it all hits right at once. I was actually looking at my schedule for today and tomorrow, and I have something like 6 interviews for stories that I'm doing and like 5 radio interviews over the next 2 days. And then also, by the way, I record a podcast. So that's how I know that we're officially back and college football is officially back. But I will tell you what, too. I don't have to answer a single question about any lawsuits or NIL. And for that, I am truly grateful.
Man, that jinxes us, I think. No, it's all gonna. Well, it was so funny. So, like, for those listening, I'm on, and again, maybe I'm not gonna excuse my predictions, but I am on hour 28 of being up since I woke up yesterday to take a flight from Buenos Aires to my home here in Minneapolis. But I remember I was getting on the plane. There were a couple of missionaries on the plane. I know they kind of are supposed to stay out of the news for like their 2-year duration. I almost want to say, like, are you guys college football fans? Look at what happened to Michigan in the last 2 years. Like, just look up Michigan. That's all you got to remember when you're allowed to access. Just look up Michigan and see what happened for the pure entertainment of it.
Are these, to be clear, are these LDS missionaries?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
I need you to break the news on the fact that BYU hired a basketball coach who should be a head NBA basketball coach. And also, by the way, a new survey came out today at CBS Sports from on our basketball side that said that coaches around the sport think that BYU ranks top 3 in NIL dollars. So I just need, actually, you need to explain NIL to them first. They might have been away too long to even fully understand what the heck is going on there.
Yeah. So, what conference is X team in?
Oh,
that's how we're judged. Like, so what?
Don't even start with that.
When you left, where was Arizona? You know. Oh my gosh, I love it. But this is going to be a fun show because it's fun to make preseason predictions and give our best guesses because we've been doing some variation of this, like building the island of contenders. But now we're kind of actually trying to see really how, make our bold calls and maybe not so bold, because sometimes you try to come up with a bold call and it's hard to make one that feels credible. So we're going to go through each of the conferences and pick our conference champs. We're going to lay out our 12-team field at the end of the season, which is going to be influenced by who's going to seeding. I mean, I seeded mine because we're obviously the top 4, presumably going to be the P4 champs. And then, show our work a little bit to how we get to the championship game, make our championship game predictions, and then finish up with some of the major awards, the Heisman, the Blitnikoff, the Nagurski, and the Coach of the Year. So this should be real fun. I'm looking forward to getting this down to this. It could really, it's fun too because there's some of these conferences, and that's the thing. Actually, a couple of these conferences, there's so many different ways we can go about it. But why don't you kick us off? What conference should we start with?
Why don't we start with the team that I have number 1 heading into the college football playoff, and that would be the champion of the Big Ten Conference. I have In, let's say, the conference championship game, in this case, because both teams I think are very relevant to what we've got going on here. I have Ohio State as my Big Ten champion, technically beating Oregon in the Big Ten title game. I will say Oregon does make my field. We'll get to them in just a second, but Ohio State, to me, this is the year, right? Like, this is the year. They're If they make it through, they're going to have to beat Oregon at some point. They're probably going to play them twice. I'd say there's a decent chance that they split those games, but if Oregon wins the regular season game and Ohio State beats them in a rematch in the Big Ten title game, I think that'll still be enough to buy them a whole lot of credibility. I think that they will beat Michigan this year, but at the same time, you don't know about that. But I think that I think that Ohio State, if they're able to come out of, let's say, the two Oregon games and Michigan at 2-1, I think that that's a lot of credibility. I think that's enough to get them the number one overall seed, and it makes them also, of course, the champions from the Big Ten.
That's a great call. I have the same potential championship right there. Now, it was interesting too because I was thinking to myself, could Penn State make it in? They could, but Oregon just seems like a stronger candidate. And truly, in this 12-team playoff scenario, there's going to be, I mean, I can't really imagine a way especially the Big Ten or SEC runner up in the title game isn't going to make that playoff field just because we're no longer doing divisions. So you're not going to get some team limping in somehow, maybe the team with the better record. I still remember that classic season where USC wasn't allowed to play in the Pac-12 title game. So UCLA had to go with a losing record into the Pac-12 title. We're not going to get anything like that. We're going to get two strong teams. And we'll maybe talk about this a little bit further, but I'm intrigued by the fact that Oregon and Ohio State have been pegged to probably play twice. And we've seen Dan Lanning have a situation where he's had to play a team twice just last season. So this may call on him to do it again. And I think absolutely they are my number one seed. Just because, again, no disrespect to the Bulldogs. I think really this has to do with just Ohio State has, as I've said, they poured a lot of money into this team. They brought some excellent coaches into this team. With Chip Kelly leading that, calling that offense, and running backs, which he loves to use as part of it, with Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson. So this should be their year, and especially at the conference level, I think that's a safe bet for potentially winning the Big Ten conference. So who should we look at next?
Yeah, let's go to my number 2 seed. Big shocker. I have the Big Ten and the SEC champions as the number 1 and 2 team. I will say, I think that my bold prediction that I've made over at CBSSports.com. Make sure and check out all of our total standings, total projections, and bold predictions as well over at CBSSports.com. My bold prediction for the SEC was that every single team in the SEC is going to have multiple losses. And that's part of why my SEC champion is number 2. It's not enough to push them all the way past the Big 12 or ACC champs to number 3 or 4. But I do think that that team will have multiple losses. And my number 2 team, it's the Georgia Bulldogs. I have them beating Texas in the SEC championship game. That second team, though, that SEC title game, there's a lot of teams who I think are going to be right on that line. I think Texas will be right there. I think that Alabama will be right there. Ole Miss, I think, will be right there. We talked about Missouri. That's a team that obviously we might get to later as well. The thing with Georgia, they have a really tough schedule at Alabama, at Texas, at Ole Miss. That's 3 of the top 6 teams in the country heading into the year. I think that they probably do lose 1 or 2 of them. They also play Clemson as a top 15 team at home in week 1. So I do think that this is a team that won't be as dominant as during their national title runs. That doesn't change at all how I feel about this team as a national title contender. It's more just how tough their road is. But I do think that they will be the number 2 team in my college football playoff. So Ohio State 1, Georgia 2.
Yeah, it's interesting because for me, I had a harder time trying to pick who Georgia was going to play because you could make a credible case for Ole Miss or Alabama or even, Mizzou if they, as we've discussed this, if they really kind of run the table. And, there's a puncher's chance for a team like a Tennessee and some others to potentially make it. But Georgia seems the safest bet. They have so much talent there. Carson Beck is absolutely going to lead that offense down the field. And the defense is a Georgia defense with Kirby Smart and company. So I think they're also, I think, a very safe bet, especially from I guess, the Power Two or the Big Two conferences in this 12-team era. So moving on, I guess now we'll get to ones where I think there's more variety, more potential for upsets that are, I think, a little bit more likely. If you could even say there's a favorite at this point in some of them. Which conference should we pick first, ACC or the Big 12?
Yeah, I'm gonna go. These two teams I think are very close, right? And these two conferences, their champions, I think will be very close. But there was one team from these two conferences that I put in my higher tier when we talked about these teams on Tuesday. So my number 3 team is the Big 12 champion, the Utah Utes. And the reason that I think that, and look, I'm a Big 12 guy by background. Everybody knows that. I think that there's going to be a lot of people who are like, oh, of course you just think that Utah is going to walk into the league and dominate. No, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. I think that their 2024 team just might be their best one yet. I think that the timing for them is just very good. They get Cameron Rising back at quarterback, but I've talked about it a little bit at backup quarterback. I love the fact that they bring in Sam Heward, who is a quarterback with a year's worth of experience playing at Cal Poly. They bring in some really good pass catchers led by Dorian Singer, the USC transfer who was a 1,000-yard receiver at Arizona. I think he teams up with Money Parks to just give them something that they haven't had in a while. Brent Keithy is one of the 2 best tight ends in the country. I think defensively, they have a chance to still be really, really good, though they probably need to try to find a legit pass rusher, but that's kind of the only real hole that you see after losing Jonah Ellis. So this is just a complete team. And I think that even though they play in a really competitive Big 12, they don't play as many of the top contenders as some of the other top 6 teams in the Big 12. They play Iowa State at home in November. They play Arizona on September 28th, at Oklahoma State on September 21st. I think that Utah-Oklahoma State game that opens Big 12 play for both teams could decide potentially who takes control of this conference. I think that team is going to be Utah. But this is, to me, a 12-1 team. A team that goes 11-1 in the regular season, wins the Big 12 championship game, and is the team that makes the college football playoff. I think that when you look at the contenders from the ACC, I think it's a little more likely that we get a 2-loss team from the ACC than Utah from the Big 12.
That's an interesting observation. Now, I admit I was getting ready to put Utah as my selection. And by the way, I love the Sam Heward story because for those who know, it's Brock Heward's son, and he started at Washington.
I think it's nephew.
Oh, is his nephew? Oh my gosh, but I do remember though he was there with behind Michael Penix and Morris in Washington, then decided to go to Cal Poly, and now is at Utah. I don't think he ever played at Washington. So Cal Poly got some experience there, and that's some good Big Sky Country, Big Sky Conference games there. But it's interesting. So I decided this is going to be the one conference. I don't want to say upset because really, again, we've talked about it. There's 6 credible teams, Utah, Oklahoma State, Kansas State, Arizona, Kansas, Iowa State. This is by far the most complicated conference to pick. So I see Utah making it, but I see a team that has shocked the conference title game before. Chris Kleiman's Kansas State Wildcats are going to go in and maybe, and I don't wish this on any team, but there could be injuries at Utah. They could just be beat up by the time they get there because this is such a competitive conference that maybe I'm going to go ahead and say the Wildcats are going to sneak in there and, well, not sneak in. They're expected to be a contender and take the conference championship and get that top 4 seeding. So that was going to be my pick. I actually then therefore put them as the 4 seed because I also believe that they're going to have a lot of losses in all of this. But that they are my selection for the Big 12 conference title. But let's head on over.
Let me touch on Kansas State just for a second because Kansas State, to me, it's Utah, Kansas State, and Oklahoma State are the 3 signature programs in the Big 12, not just for 24, but over the next few years. To me, I feel like Kansas State is a year away. Like, I think that with a first-year starting quarterback in Avery Johnson, with a lot of transition on the offensive line, with some key transition among the pass catchers, I think that Kansas State is going to be a little closer to a 9-3 team, or like a good 10-2, but not necessarily a conference championship game 10-2. And I've said before too, I think in the Big 12 there might be 4 or 5 teams that are 10-2 or 11-1 and are fighting for tiebreakers. I had Kansas State out of my title game. I think that, for me, the team that I picked number 2, actually, when we did our CBS Sports predictions, was Iowa State. I've talked them up all off season. I don't think that this is a team that will be able to make it as an at-large for various reasons, one of which I think they'll probably lose to Iowa in week 2. But I do think that they're going to be the second team from the Big 12 in the Big 12 title game. I think that Kansas State, like, they deserve program wise the credibility of kind of being slotted in the way that they are. I just don't know if this is the best Kansas State that we're going to get. And in a year where the top 6 is so close, where you have Arizona in the non-conference, where Kansas, if they're fully healthy, Kansas might be not just the second best, might be the best team in the league. The question is going to be about health. I think that there are just too many teams for me to pencil in Kansas State. I think that Utah's depth is just a little more well-positioned to do that. But I also might be wrong. And also, by the way, I would not be mad at all to be wrong, because I think that what Kansas State has built there is incredible.
Oh, absolutely. And I think Utah, again, was one I wanted to pick. But I think if a conference is going to give us an unexpected, and again, especially for the more casual fans who really haven't paid attention to how this all breaks down, they're going to be like, how did Kansas State, Iowa State, Arizona, like, or even Utah, like, how are they the number 3 or number 4 team in the country? And they're going to totally miss we're going to have to teach them all. We're going to have to educate them about how seeding works versus rankings. But should we wrap up the conference champs with the ACC? Now, I know we both went with the flashy Hurricanes last episode. Are you sticking with them?
I am. That's my number 4 seed. Like I said, I think that there's more of a chance of them having, let's say, 2 losses. I look at that road game against Florida. Like, Miami should be better than Florida, but I could see them dropping a game like that. They actually have a stretch in the middle that's a little weird, which is versus Virginia Tech, at Cal. That's obviously a cross-country road game. At Louisville versus Florida State. I think that they lose one in that 4, most likely, but I think that overall they're going to be able to get through it, still make the ACC title game, and still have a chance to win the ACC title game. This is a team that I expect by December 7th or 6th or whatever ACC title game is. I think that this is a team that will be rolling, will be really just like together and rolling, and again, in a conference, and actually I jumped on with a Raleigh, North Carolina station this morning to talk about one of my favorite teams, which is NC State. I think that this is an ACC where, if you don't think that the top 2 of Florida State or Clemson are going to be above the field, it totally opens things up. Where I think you could talk about a Miami, an NC State, an SMU, a Virginia Tech, a Louisville. There's just so many teams that I think who have the ability to get into that 9-10 win range. But I think that Miami is the team for me right now that has the highest ceiling of the group.
Because I agree with you about Miami, only because, again, I think the talent they brought in, and Mario Cristobal's coaching errors aside, I think he still can put together a heck of a team. My next question on this is, who do you think they're going to play in the ACC title game?
So again, one of the reasons that they had me on in Raleigh this morning is because I was the only one who picked NC State as my number 2. And we've talked about them as much as anybody nationally, I feel like, this offseason, but I do want to circle back on them. Defensively, this is year in, year out, a top 3 defense in the ACC. I think that even after losing Peyton Wilson, they still have a lot of pieces to be that once again. But what makes me really excited is the offense. A good offensive line coming back. Grayson McCall at quarterback, and we'll see exactly how good he is. I'm not projecting him as like an all ACC player, but I think he will be an above average quarterback in the ACC at least. I think that certainly you talk about the receivers, Kevin Concepcion, a player who I know that you're real fond of, Noah Rogers coming in as a transfer from Ohio State, who's actually from North Carolina too, which is kind of fun. And I think the most underrated addition of the offseason was the Duke transfer running back Jordan Waters to really solidify that position. I think this is a team that, if things break right for them, they could be a truly complete team. And their schedule overall, pretty manageable. I'm definitely going to have them because I will say I haven't. I'm still weighing my number 11 spot. The number 11 spot for me right now is one that I go back and forth on. A lot of that, I think, for this particular NC State team, because just going through their schedule, they're at Clemson in week 4. Let's just say that they win that game. The rest of the schedule pretty open for them. Versus Northern Illinois, Wake Forest, Syracuse, at Cal, versus Stanford, versus Duke, at Georgia Tech, at North Carolina. Not like, I mean, they're not guaranteed to win all those games, but I think that they'll be favored in the vast majority of them. Where this really comes down to is that September 7th game, NC State versus Tennessee. If they find a way to win that game, and I would probably lean Tennessee right now in that game, but if they find a way to win that game, their pathway to being an at-large in the college football playoff, like it goes up by like 5 times, right? It goes from being like a 10% possibility to like a 50% possibility if they win that game against Tennessee. Because I think Tennessee is going to be one of the top teams, not at the very top, but one of the top teams, one of the really competitive teams from the SEC. If they lose that game, I think it's going to be kind of tough because I think that Tennessee is probably not a college football playoff team from the SEC. So if you lose that game and then lose 1 or 2 more, I think you have to be an ACC champion. So I'm really high, though, overall on NC State. I think the path is there. I think that the talent is there. I think that they're stacked really everywhere that you need them to be. So I had them as my number 2 ACC team that Miami will beat in the ACC title game.
Yeah, this was again another situation where it's tough to pick the second team because NC State was one I've also been, as you've said, fond of. Louisville, Florida State, if you believe they can reload, but I'm a little skeptical about that until I see how this season goes through. I'm not going to necessarily put now the Irish national champions this weekend. Cool, but we've seen how Northwestern handled it when they won that a couple of years ago against Nebraska. But I went with Clemson, and I just want to give Dabo one last shot here. I think he knows what he's doing, and I know this is either going to go one of 2 ways. This is going to be the make. I wonder if not make or break for his like. I don't think they would ever fire him or anything like that. But this is going to be where if this season doesn't work out, he I can't even imagine the pressure going into next season and really the off season. Quite frankly, once they see because we already saw what it was like this off season with the transfer portal, but. I think if Clemson is going to put together a season that shows that they still can do it, especially under Dabo's approach to coaching, which I think it'll be this season. I think they've got enough there to do it. Now, this is my least confident pick. I actually feel more confident that Kansas State could upset Utah in the Big 12 championship than I think Clemson will be the other team. I don't think the loser of this game will necessarily be an at-large. Although that NC State path was great. I think you make a great point, especially if they can beat Tennessee in that exciting game that's going to be in Bristol. But this is one where I think my least confidence is who Miami's actually going to play. Because it is hard to pick. And you're right, we could end up with a Virginia Tech and SMU. Cal's got a great running back. Would it be hilarious if Cal suddenly got it together in a season where they're going to be hemorrhaging money, flying from place to place for just a small share of the conference pie? That would be, I don't know, that would be my favorite. But not favorite. I don't want to say like I'm not rooting for Cal to lose money, but it is part of the brand. If you know anything about Cal's finances, they are the worst program at managing money. But or they love to take debt. They love to take debt without any idea of how to pay it back. But
to be fair to Cal, building in Berkeley, not the cheapest thing to do. So it isn't all their fault, right? It's extremely UCLA issues, right? We're building anything new in LA.
The Cal thing is, though, they built that stadium thinking they were going to be making like USC numbers in terms of fans suddenly all wanting to show up for the product. And then the product started to stink. So they spent a fortune and ends up they spent, I forgot, like the amount of money they spent on debt service. Like they are a country mile ahead of every other program in terms of debt. And it was just, one AD, the power of one AD. It is absolutely remarkable. I'm not going to name
All
names,
right.
but it's the power
We
of
don't
one
have to keep roasting Cal. This is a pro Cal podcast. I disavow all of this. Let's do this though. Let's also pick our group of 5 champion. It's
Mm.
because that obviously is going to be a guaranteed spot. Most likely, they're not. I want to be clear about the way that the system works. They're not guaranteed to be the 12th seed. They're just not guaranteed anything higher than the 12th seed. So realistically, they're probably most years going to be the 12th seed. So we're going to project them. I'm at least going to project them as the 12th seed. And I know that they've kind of been the like hot story this offseason, but I think that there's really something to it. I'm going to pick Boise State from the Mountain West as my champion. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, I think that they just have more star power than any other group of 5 team heading into 2024. You talk about a player like Ashton Genty at running back. I mean, he could start anywhere in the country and make that team immediately better. So I mean, he is just one of those players who I'm not going to go as far as saying that he's going to get into the Heisman race or anything like that, because I just think it's really hard to do that as a running back, of course, at Boise State. But I do think that he is going to be on the minds of All America voters, right? I'm one of the selectors. I think that he's going to be in that conversation. And they also, by the way, have a defensive lineman, Ahmed Hassanian, who is also one of the best defensive players in college football. Just a total game changer of a pass rusher. So when you talk about players of that level, especially compared to, I think, a rest of a Mountain West that could be a little rebuilding. Fresno State, of course, with an interim head coach, UNLV breaking in a new quarterback after the transfer of Jaden Mayava. Well, to me, Boise State is the team with the pathway to being elite, and they do play Oregon in week 2. They can't get destroyed in that game. Like they can't. They can't. If they get liberied in week 2, then they're just not going to make it, right? Like they're just not going to. I don't think that they will. I think that their trenches will hold up a little bit better than that. But I think that Boise State is the team that I'm riding with into 2024.
I totally agree about the Heisman issue there, because I mean, if Marshall Faulk couldn't get past Gino Toretta, that's when you know, like that. You look back at that vote, and you're
Boise
like,
ain't San Diego State too, to be fair, but like still,
yeah, I know, but it's just kind of, you feel
fair.
bad when you have a. To be fair, also San Diego State just wasn't that great of a team that season
Exactly.
either. That it was literally just one guy basically carrying the entire team on his on his legs the entire season. But no, I went with Boise State as well. I was debating. I think the American's going to be too much of of a war again, where no one's going to come out with a clean enough record. And Liberty again.
They're going to be making any excuse that they can to not put Liberty in the field, even if they're 13-0, just because of what happened last year. And by the way, you add to that, they do play Appalachian State in the non-conference, so that's something. Like App State might be the Sun Belt champion. If they are, I think that helps them a little bit. But they don't have even a game like what New Mexico State was last year. After New Mexico State goes and wins 10 games and beats Auburn, like they don't have that kind of moment. They don't have that kind of team. And like I think if Liberty is 13-0, I think that, let's say Boise State's 11-2. Well, if one of those losses to Oregon, I think that people are forgiving that even potentially a little bit more than what SMU got forgiven last season. And SMU was pretty loud too about the fact that they were left out with 2 more losses. So I think that the second best champion would have to look kind of bad for Liberty to me to get into the field. And by the way, making it through 2 undefeated regular seasons also is pretty hard, no matter who you are.
I'm imagining the conference committee kind of quietly saying, "Hey, Oregon State, like, are you guys willing to consider yourselves a G5 this season? We'll let you in." Oh my goodness, that would be, yeah. So no, I like it. Well, before we go into break, let's lay out our 12 team fields, and they're not necessarily going to be identical. Why don't you go first?
So we talked about it. I think that 2 of the top 3 teams in the country right now play in the Big Ten. I think that Oregon, after losing the Big Ten title game, is going to be number 5. I did roll with Texas at number 6. I just think I have some questions about them. I've been upfront about that, but I do think that they're going to be just a slight head above the rest of the SEC, enough at least to put them in this conversation. I ultimately went with Alabama at number 7. I think that this team is going to be better than people think. And while they, I think, might sort of end up with a math problem of getting left out of the SEC title game just due to tiebreakers and whatever, I do think ultimately this is a team at 10-2 that will still be number 7. Partially because I think there might be a slight gap between number 7 and number 8. That's where I put Penn State. I'm relatively excited, frankly, about Penn State and their opportunity to make the field as the third best Big Ten team. Because this is why the college football playoff exists, is so that you can get some matchups that are a little different and potentially give yourself an opportunity to go and win some games. So I have Penn State number 8, the SEC's Penn State, Ole Miss at number 9, Notre Dame at 10, and 11 is like, again, I'm right there on the edge with them. So the two teams I'm considering most, I'd say, because I've said I think Iowa State will make the Big 12 title game, and I think that they are going to lose to Iowa, and that's going to ruin their chance of being able to make the field. I will say if Kansas State is that team that's 12-1 or 11-2, I think that Kansas State could get in as the 11 seed. I think if Oklahoma State maybe gets through, if Arizona, but I don't know about Iowa State, especially because I think people are gonna, like, some of this just comes down to like brand credibility, and I hate that, right? Like, I hate that. That's not how I want to look at this, but I do think that Iowa State, after going 7-6 last year, people are going to talk about them a certain way that I don't think is fair. So that's why I don't have another Big 12 team in this conversation. But the teams that I'm deciding between are Missouri and NC State. Missouri, we talked about on our earlier program. Very manageable schedule. Very, very manageable schedule. In some ways, maybe too easy when it comes to trying to cement yourself as a team from to make the college football playoff. And by the way, I mentioned I think that every team in the SEC could have multiple losses. There's a pathway to Missouri being 11-1, lose maybe even big to Alabama, and still make the SEC title game, which would certainly throw a huge wrench into everything. But I think that they probably will lose at least one more. So we're talking about a 10-2, let's say, Missouri versus, let's say, an 11-2 NC State, who probably would need to beat Tennessee to even be in this conversation. That's probably what we're looking at. I think I can't go as far at this point as saying that I think NC State will beat Tennessee. So I guess I'm going to go with Missouri, a fifth SEC team, as my number 11 and Boise State number 12.
All right, I'll quickly rattle through mine. So I agree mostly with the seeding you have, although I actually differentiate pretty quickly now that I think about it. Ohio State's my number 1, followed by Georgia, and Miami and Kansas State, because I think the Kansas State upset would mean they'd be the 4th seed. Then here's where it gets into, I'm going to foresee the committee realizing that the 5 and 6 seeds are close enough that you can switch them just to make a better matchup that isn't a rematch. I see Notre Dame being placed at number 5 because they're going to have a heck of a season. They may even have one loss, but all these teams are going to have one loss. Maybe the committee wants to put them there because then they get to host the G5 rather than a rematch of Oregon hosting Boise State. So then Boise State would end up heading into, and we'll get to that after the break, but that's my thinking there. So I have Notre Dame, Oregon. I think Ole Miss will lose the SEC title game. They were the one I thought could make it this year. This will be their chance. So they'll get a little bit of the benefit of the doubt and be a little higher ranked than Texas as number 8. I have Penn State as number 9. And then I actually thought, okay, I think Mizzou could beat Alabama. So what if Mizzou beats Alabama? I have them as number 10 and Alabama as number 11, just to absolutely anger everybody who isn't a member of the SEC. And then, of course, Boise State to close it out. But the scary thing is when I played this out in my mind, I'm like, I could totally see this happening. And I can completely hear the rants and raves. I mean, at that point, we're just asking for a Florida State team that's somehow going to have like one loss or two losses being left out just to to drive them absolutely bonkers. But I think one loss Florida State team would absolutely end up in these scenarios.
Yes.
But when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about how we think these playoffs might work out here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
Okay, so now we get to kind of the fun part, because now we've gone through our conference champions. We've laid out our prediction of the 12-team field. How do we think these first round games are going to go? So I'll let you go first, Shehan, because you have, and I think we're going to have two tracks here, because that's the only way we can have it. We can't possibly really converse it. But let's talk about what are your four first round games hosted on home campuses?
Yeah, so Oregon plays Boise State in a rematch of a game that will happen in week 2. Like you said, I think that they might look for a good excuse to not do that game again. But I think that there's a realistic possibility that Oregon's just way ahead of every other at-large team, and you have to put them at number 5. But I do have Oregon winning that game. I think it will be competitive, especially since we'll be playing for a second time. But depth-wise, that's where I have them winning out. Texas, Missouri, I guess it's an SC on SC game. That's kind of sucks. But I have Texas winning that game. It'll be a good game, though, because Texas last year, their issues were in the secondary. They're going to be better this year. Andrew Makuba coming in at safety. Malik Muhammad was their best corner as a freshman, but didn't play in the Sugar Bowl last year against Washington. I think they'll be able to handle Luther Burden just a little bit better than how they handled Washington's receivers last year. But I do think Texas does win that game. I think Alabama actually beats Notre Dame kind of bad. I don't think that Notre Dame is built to deal with some of the things that Alabama is going to be able to do. And by the way, we'll get back to Alabama and some of their good players in just a second. Penn State Ole Miss, I guess that's another rematch from last year's bowl season. That's not what I intended to do, certainly. But I think that Penn State actually takes the game. I think that Penn State is going to come together. I love the fact that they hired Andy Kotelnicki. I think that they're going to be more dynamic by the end of the year. If you ask me about this game in week 1, I would lean Ole Miss. I think, though, that Penn State does take care of business in this version. And by the way, this is the fun part. This is where the playoff gets interesting. We get to play a December game in State College, Pennsylvania. So Lane Kiffin's going to have to be standing there in a parka, potentially coaching this game. I think that this is like the first, hey, Big Ten weather game that we get in the college football playoff.
That is a nice find in that, I got to admit. So going with the way I seeded it, here are the number 12 Boise Broncos are going to go into Notre Dame Stadium. And here is a situation where I could see an upset. Notre Dame has had a habit of losing these games. So I'm going to say this is that moment the G5 teams were hoping for. Notre Dame is going to get an upset by Boise State, and they're going to move on to the next round. So pencil that one in, everybody. After that, and here's the thing, though. By switching Notre Dame and Oregon, you actually get a very intriguing match in the other game, too. You get number 11 seed Alabama at number 6 seed Oregon. I mean, it's a great match. The intrigue of getting Lanning versus DeBoer again, that's going to absolutely have its own storylines. It's at Autzen. Alabama being an 11 seed also implies they're not quite, your Saban top Alabama team. So I'm going to see Lanning gets his revenge and Oregon wins at home to move on.
But have you considered the fact that Kalen DeBoer just owns Dan Lanning?
Wouldn't that be? I mean, if he loses that, he could just be like, Oregon fans will be like, no one in our wildest dreams thought this was going to be a potential problem. Their legend, though, will be etched in stone at that point, I think, especially if they continue to match up. Next round would be, and again, kind of going to what you said, because you also had an SEC game, but they were teams like that hadn't played each other in the regular season.
Yes.
I would have number 10 Mizzou face going to Ole Miss in a game that hasn't happened in the regular season. And here is where I think Mizzou is going to get momentum as the season moves on. I think their running back tandem is going to really pick up. I think they have that ability to be a team that can compete. We saw bowl season last season, they stepped up and competed and defeated Ohio State. So here's where I think Mizzou could take out Ole Miss. and move on to that next round. So I have another visiting team winning in this situation. Then finally, we have another. This is going to be a great game. It's Penn State at Texas. Ultimately, I think Texas will win at home. And I think they'll move on to the quarterfinals in this scenario as well. Then let's move on to the quarterfinals. How do
Well, I
your
will
quarterfinal?
say I will say one thing too. The hilarity, like we've talked at length about the SEC and their scheduling practices and how like the East and West never played. Ole Miss and Missouri have played one time since 2013. One time. What a freaking joke, man! Teams that are supposed to be in the same conference, they're trying to address some of this with some of their new scheduling methods, but uh, this is going to be one thing. Is yes, we're going to get some SEC on SEC, Big Ten on Big Ten. I mean, who knows? Maybe even an ACC on ACC or a Big 12 on Big 12. Half these teams haven't even actually played each other because of the way that these schedules work out.
That's absolutely fantastic. But going to the quarterfinals, how do yours now work out? Because now we have the top four seeds are now placed into their, and again they're trying to keep the traditional matchups. Of course, it depends on who's in the quarterfinals. So, for example, we're not going to necessarily have an orange tradition or a cotton traditional matchup here. But how do your quarterfinals pan out?
Yeah, so in this second round, we'd get Ohio State versus Penn State. That would suck a little bit. Maybe if in my mind's eye, I'll try to nudge Ole Miss into that game. But I think that Ohio State would beat Penn State's. Look, Penn State. It's kind of like we've talked about, right? It's the Mendoza line game of the Big Ten. I think that Ohio State is going to be well above the Mendoza line of the Big Ten in 2024. So I think Ohio State takes that game in the 2-7 matchup. We're gonna have Georgia versus Alabama, actually another rematch of a regular season game. This will be a big one. I'm fascinated to see how these two teams will change over the course of the season. I'm gonna pick Georgia to win that game. I think that Georgia is just going to be on a collision course, and I think that they're just a little deeper right now, especially after some of the transfers that Alabama had in the 3-6 game. Oh, this is a Big 12 game that we wouldn't have actually gotten, which is Texas versus Utah. How about that? This is going to be another one of those fun things, right? Utah, of course, joining the conference right as Texas leaves. Ooh, this is a good game. This is a good game. Some of this is going to depend on where Texas is from a running back perspective at this point. We've talked about their injuries and how that might impact them. And I think it'll also depend a little bit on where Utah is in the secondary. That's one position of slight concern after losing some players to the NFL. Uh, and Texas is going to be a team that's going to be able to take advantage of that. I think I'm going to take Texas to win this version of the game. I think that they're just a little more physical. I think that they're a little well. That's actually a very that's probably something I should never say about a team playing Utah. But I think that they're going to be able to really, I think, have some success in the trenches and ultimately do just enough offensively to win that game. So I do have Texas pulling that upset technically. And then in the 4-5 game, Miami versus Oregon. Whew, that's a wild game. That is a wild game. I think Oregon's just a little too far along for Miami to be able to hang. I would make the comparison. Actually, by the way, the battle for Mario Cristobal's rosters, that's what we'd be looking at here. I think that Oregon, right, like they are, I guess if you could say on the Mario development curve, they're kind of like a year 5 program of from a development perspective, whereas Miami will be looking at more of a year 3 of a roster development. So I think that Oregon does take that game. So I would have the 5 and 6 beating the 3 and 4, which is obviously something that people will have warned about, I think, a little bit. But I do think that they will take those games. So into my quarterfinals, I have who are my top 4 teams: Ohio State, Georgia, Oregon, Texas.
Interesting. I like those picks. Now, with my scenario again, I tried to also match these up because they're trying to put teams close to their tradition. So the Rose will, assumably in this scenario, have Ohio State, and therefore the again pairing up with the winner of that match, the other match will be Texas in my scenario. So we'll have an Ohio State Texas Rose Bowl, which I'm going to be honest, even though it's not a traditional Rose Bowl matchup, those Rose Bowl guys are going to be thrilled to have that one in there. And I think Ohio State will ultimately win there. In the Sugar Bowl, I have Georgia against Mizzou. So again, we've got another SEC matchup that didn't take place in the regular season. So once again, not a rematch. I think Georgia will prevail there in their first round of the playoffs in the quarters. Then we get to the two interesting ones. Number 3 seed Miami will probably be, in my mind, in the Peach Bowl, hosting or probably against Oregon. So we both have a Miami versus Oregon. And yeah, intrigue game 2. Like Oregon just keeps getting intrigue games because you have Mario Cristobal, against his old team. Again, for the same reasons you do, I see Oregon prevailing there. And then finally, we get a very fun fiesta. Boise State returns to the Fiesta Bowl to play Kansas State. I'm going to say Boise will try really hard, but I think a Kansas State team that gets that break, and this is where the break for the conference champs may come into play. I just don't think I can't. I want to say Boise State can pull it off. I think they could. But I have Kansas State prevailing and moving on into the semis. So interestingly enough, my semis are all the P4 champs, which I kind of felt bad admitting that that's what I came up with, but that's where I got there. So let's talk about those. Like, take us through your semis. They're going to be in the orange. They're going to be in the cotton. I don't know how they're going to decide who goes where. Is it going to be like the way they've done the 14 playoff? Will the team just get to pick?
Yeah, so I think that they'll kind of give them priority, essentially. They'll probably, I think, if I understand right, they'll probably set it based on like where the projected teams would end up. So basically the semis would be decided by who's the number 1 seed, who's the number 2 seed. So I ended up actually, the committee's going to have to rig this. Like, they're going to have to rig this. Oregon cannot be the 5 seed. I've decided it after seeing what would happen, because we'd be getting a rematch of Oregon Boise State in the first round, like I mentioned. And in the third round, I'm projecting basically the 2 conference championship games over again: Ohio State, Oregon, and Georgia, Texas. That's not going to do. We're going to have to get the committee together and figure that thing out, because we cannot have.
No, wait. My version, you get Oregon Intrigue 3 because they're paired up with Georgia. So you're going to have Kirby Smart versus Dan Lanning again. Like, every version of my Oregon has like the best storyline. Not necessarily that they're going to win this particular round, but they're going to have the best storyline going into it, with Ohio State and K-State in the orange for me. But how do you see this? So do you think they're going to flip them around?
Man, it is just so many potential, this would be, I think, in some ways, like, I don't want to say the nightmare scenario of the expanded playoff, but like a little bit, right? Like that would be a little bit of the nightmare scenario of the playoff. I want to be as open and optimistic as you are about the idea of upsets. And by the way, I will say, like, beating a top 5 to 8 team, even if you're really good, is hard. Like, we've talked about it. Ryan Day is 1-6 against top 5 teams. That's not because he's a bad coach. It's because it's really hard to win those games. Michigan lost a lot of games against top 5 teams. Georgia has lost a lot of games against top 5 teams. So realistically, we might be in a position where there are more losses than what I project, because there's going to be a lot more teams that are closer to being peers than I'm probably giving them credit for. But, sometimes I have to be just a little bit doomer. So in this scenario, I think that we get the same results. I think we get Ohio State over Oregon. I think we get Georgia over Texas. This would be the 3rd iteration of Ohio State, Oregon. Like, maybe what ends up happening is that Georgia ends up being the 1 seed and Ohio State ends up being the 2 seed to avoid this possibility. And just to be clear, I've been inside the mock playoff selection committee. They don't sit here and like model these things out to figure out how can we make sure that we get some of the matches that we want. That's not how it works. But if they wanted to start doing that based off of what I've just put together, I wouldn't be opposed to it.
I love that. And I was realizing the way I had set this up by switching just to avoid the Oregon Boise State rematch. I had somehow avoided the potential for these other rematches, because I was thinking, imagine we get that scenario. Imagine that Oregon wins the Big Ten championship, and Boise State or Liberty have to go to the horseshoe for that first round game, which would actually be rather intriguing. And I'm going to be honest, I'm taking Ohio State in either of those scenarios far more than that Notre Dame one I came up with. Or what happens if Dan Lanning has to play and somehow loses to Ryan Day 3 times, and it's like, hey, it's Kalen DeBoer 2.0 for him. I don't know. Like, it just, again, that would be those are some of my particular thoughts on that. But yeah, no. So yeah, I have Ohio State beating Kansas State, Georgia beating Oregon. We have that Ohio State, Georgia. national championship game. And it's so funny. Ohio State, my basis for that is simply because this seems to be their moment. We've talked about it. We've dug deep into it. The transfers, the existing talent that's still there, the adding Chip Kelly, all of that just seems to be shaping up for this kind of I don't want to say once in a generation, but truly feels that way at Ohio State, that this should be their time. And Kirby Smart is Kirby Smart. It's Georgia. They're still loaded. They've got Carson Beck. They've got talent on both sides of the ball. He is merciless in the postseason. Like, are we going to see? Are we going to get is it going to be like TCU Georgia, and is it going to be like Florida State Georgia? Are we going to see games like that as they go through and just rip teams apart? I mean, only because of this ruthlessness, which I'm not going to say they're trying to I think they just play the team like it's any other game. It's not like you don't feel like those teams have lost focus under Kirby Smart, which is an absolute credit to him. So I think they'll make it there, and ultimately, and I guess we've been giving. Who do you think is going to win? You've been leading us off each time.
This is, I think, potentially one of the best title games that we will have had in the past 25 years if we get Ohio State versus Georgia. They come into the year number 1 and number 2 in essentially every single ranking, every single poll, every single projection. These are two teams that I think are in so many ways the same and in so many ways different as well. It's funny. Ohio State is an offensive team that I think will be carried by their defense if things go well. Georgia is a defensive team that I think could be even better on the offensive side of the ball. Georgia will have the better quarterback in this game. Ohio State might have the best defenders in this game. It's crazy. It's this clash of moments and styles and the North versus South component, right? You've got Columbus, Ohio versus Athens, Georgia. You've got the coach who's been there, done that, won 2 national titles against the one who is trying to get over the hump in so many ways. It's a rematch, by the way, of that 2022 game where Ohio State obviously should have won that game and probably would have won a national championship if a field goal goes the right direction. It's every dynamic about this game is fascinating. And so heading into this one, I think it's going to come down to a few components. One, I think it's going to come down to where is Ohio State's offensive line at this time? They added a transfer in Seth McLaughlin at center to try to shore up that interior, but they have to replace quite a bit of production. If they can do that, I feel really good about what this team can be. It's also going to be how healthy is this team, especially at the quarterback position. I expect they're going to run Will Howard quite a bit. And will they have found that perfect balance, especially with a new offensive coordinator, to try to figure out, what can this unit be? What do we want to accomplish? How do we want to try to attack? Because I don't think that they can, not that they can't beat Georgia playing a pocket style game, but they don't have CJ Stroud this time. And they don't have, I don't think, as proven a group of receivers in 2024, though they'll still be extremely good at that position. For Georgia, it's going to be, do they have kind of that next in line in terms of game-changing defensive linemen? They didn't have that in 2023. They had some very good players, but there was no Jalen Carter. There was no Jordan Davis. And I think that they suffered in some ways for that. So will they be able to develop kind of that next group? And the other piece too is, I think, are they able to be as efficient in the passing game as we feel like they can be? Like, this could be one of the best passing offenses in the country if Carson Beck has more legitimate weapons to throw to. So I go back and forth about this one. I think that Georgia has more sure things, but the upside that Ohio State provides to me is just undeniable. And the other piece too is that this is the most pressure-filled season that Ohio State has had in decades. They invested more than $20 million of NIL into this team. According to the athletic director, he's bragging about how much they put into this season and into this team. I think that the veterans, I think that the coaching staff, I think that the pressure, I think it creates a diamond. I think Ohio State is the 2024 national champion.
It's interesting too. You just the way you phrased it, and I agree. I think Ohio State is more likely to win here, but it reminds me a little bit of the way Michigan headed into last season. Like, this is it. This is the year. Harbaugh's been
Yes.
building to this all these years. He's got all these seniors. This is going to be it. Yeah, there's going to be all. I mean, they have the luxury of pressure to win with what they've spent versus, hey, the whole program might be imploded. Like, we might be a smoking crater at the end of the season, but we're going to make it through Michigan. So I think for those reasons, I went the same way. And if it doesn't, oh my gosh, this is going to be one of those great the off-season material that is going to be written about this program, or in season, depending if it starts to go off the rails early. I'm going to I go with the same one. I don't want to belabor it because I want us to also have a chance to talk about some of these national awards. Because gets intriguing. I'm actually, when I was looking at the awards, I'm like, with this extended playoff, are some of these deadlines for voting awards, are they going to be moved back? Because we're going to be having some potentially intriguing games here with finalists for some of these awards. So we'll go again. We're going to go through 4 of the awards here. How do you foresee the Heisman race working out?
So I think that this is a weird Heisman field because I don't think that there's like an obvious guy coming into the year. Dylan Gabriel has been ranked number 1 on a lot of boards, and I'm a Dylan Gabriel fan, but I don't think he's I don't see that, right? Like I don't even see him being asked to do that much, frankly. And his numbers are going to be compared a lot to what Bo Nix did last year. And I think that there's a chance that he's a more effective college football player, but his numbers are not going to be as good as Bo Nix's were last year. I think the other piece too is that when I look around college football, especially at the quarterback position, I just don't see very many players in the mold of, frankly, a lot of players from last season. There's no Caleb Williams. There's no Jaden Daniels. There's no Michael Penix, I would argue. And that's not a pro or a con. I think that these teams are going to be very effective. They're just going to be less dependent on an individual player. But there's one exception. There's one exception. There's one guy who I think has the potential to be that do-everything player for a team that I think will be in the college football playoff. And he's going to be working with a coaching staff that's brand new to his program that I think will actually get more out of him than any other coaching staff possibly could. So I'm going with Jalen Milroe, the Alabama quarterback. I think that this is the year that things come together. You saw so many flashes last year, but this is the year that it comes together. Kalen DeBoer is the perfect coach to make this happen. He got the most out of Michael Penix. He's gotten the most out of every quarterback, essentially everywhere that he's ever coached. And to go from such a defensive staff at Alabama that really just wanted to be kind of solid and consistent on offense to one that I think will really unleash him, I think Jalen Milroe is poised to take a huge step this year.
I think that is a good pick. And it'll be remarkable to see if he's in that final 3 kind of, or however they decide to how many finalists they invite to New York. I wonder if he'll also get a bit of a boost because people would go like, hey, last season we saw what Kalen DeBoer did with another quarterback, and look at this change that we've seen here. I wonder if he'll get a little bit of boost like that when like a movie director, did some amazing movies, didn't win Best Director, and then you sometimes feel the Academy's like, ooh, we should have given him an award. Let's do, The Departed. Fine. Yeah. Sometimes you get a movie like that comes out. So all of that said, I think because I said Alabama, I think is going to end up sneaking in as that 11 seed. I'm not sure Milroe will get an opportunity to shine, which means I have to go with a safer route, which I'm not thrilled about because I agree. I had trouble with this. I think Quinn Ewers will edge Carson Beck, only because Texas, in my scenario, will make it through. They'll make it. They'll be competent, a little bit better than LSU this previous year. And again, with Ewers, I could see that getting the benefit where Beck might get, not for any reason, just say like, oh, well, that's Georgia, where less than Texas is back mentality. And then with the way the season goes and the way the playoff goes, we're going to probably hear people complain that ballots were submitted too early. And that maybe had they had a later opportunity, we would have seen perhaps Beck or even another player rise up to be the Heisman winner. Now,
and And I'll say too, just real quick, right? So I had Alabama number 7 on mine. I think that 7 will be good enough for him to win the Heisman. 11 would be tougher, right? If they're just sneaking in, I don't think Jalen Milrow wins the Heisman that way. But when I look at my top 6, Ohio State, just too many guys. I don't think that they have a standout candidate. Georgia, I think, will have a little bit of the too many guys issue. And the other thing, too, is that, like I talked about, I think that they're going to be an 11-2 team. I think they're going to lose 2 regular season games. And people are going to be like, oh, well, Beck wasn't as good as he was last year, when actually they just played a much tougher schedule. Utah, I don't think Cameron Rising is a legitimate candidate for the Heisman. I don't think he's going to have the numbers to do it. Miami's interesting with Cameron Ward, but like he'll also have Damian Martinez back there. He'll have Sam Brown. He'll have Xavier Restrepo. I think they're also in a bit of a too many guys role. Oregon, to me, definitely in a too many guys role. I'm so curious how Quinn Ewers is viewed this December, right? Because he's a very good quarterback. There's no doubt about it. Like top 3 to 5 quarterback in college football. I don't think anybody could argue that. But like so much of this is like we had the 2023 quarterback season, and what a top 3 quarterback was in 2023 is just very different than what it is in 2024. I mean, we look at the list of NFL draft prospects, for example. Nobody's really projected as a top 5 pick right now. Like none of the quarterbacks are really thought of in that kind of way. So maybe, and the other thing too is that Texas will have gone from being the number 3 team in the country to being the number 6 team or 7 team. So like, will people view it as like, well, they had a worse season, but maybe if they go through the SEC and like maybe it won't matter. And I do think that one thing that works in Quinn's favor is that they are not going to have a standout receiver. They're more going to have 4 or so guys who balance out the receiving. And I think as a quarterback, that's probably a better position for you to be in when you're competing for the Heisman. So I think Quinn's a good safe pick, like you said. I just don't know. This is a tough Heisman race, and I would not be shocked. I don't have the team. I think that you probably have to make the playoff to truly compete for the Heisman Trophy, but I wouldn't be shocked if like Luther Burden or like Riley Leonard or one of these types of players finds a way to play their way up with much bigger numbers than what people expect.
Oh, absolutely. How about Blitnikoff? Who's going to be the best receiver?
Well, I think that I just gave away the game just a little bit. I think it's going to be Luther Burden, another player who I think will key a run to the college football playoff for a team. I remember watching him as a freshman and just being like, yeah, dude, just toss the ball to him. I don't know, run some screens, figure out any way possible to get him the ball because he's just so clearly the best player on the field. And the fact that he was able to grow the way he did in year 2 with all the attention that he received is crazy. I think that Luther Burden is this year's Marvin Harrison Jr. in a lot of ways, where he's going to come into the year, everybody's going to know he's the guy, and I think that he might end up actually being as good or better than what people expect. So I think to me, that's the easy, safe pick.
Yeah, I'm the same on that. I think Luther Burden III is the easiest safe pick on this. So let's move to the other side of the ball. Who do you think is going to win the Nagurski? Which I love the Bronco Nagurski Award because I love Bronco Nagurski. He's the pride of the Minnesota Gophers of all time. Back when they were a terror on the gridiron. Who do we think is going to be the best defender?
This is a really tough one. This is a really tough one. I think that this though is where you see the more very top of the field start to get a little bit more credit, right? Like we talked about, picking a standout from Ohio State or Georgia is just really tough because of the amount of guys that they have. But I think that I'm gonna go. There's 2 players that I think are top of my board. Both play for Ohio State. That would be Caleb Downs at safety and JT Tuimoloau at defensive end. I think for JT to win, he'd have to be a 10 sack guy, and he just hasn't quite been that. And part of it is the depth that they have on the defensive line. So I'm going to go with Caleb Downs. I mean, especially again, I mean, Jim Knowles' system really emphasizes safety play. It really emphasizes having multiple guys who can play at multiple levels of the field. I think Caleb Downs is that guy in this defense. So if they take a big step forward, especially in the passing game on defense, I think Caleb Downs is going to get a lot of that credit.
That's a good call. I was going with the opportunity to highlight a player who I think will be dynamite on their team, which may not make the playoffs. And I went with Will Johnson. I think he is going to be the guy at Michigan because Michigan's defense is still going to be a stunner, I think. And he's going to highlight that. I actually debated Travis Hunter, but I think the two-way
Sure.
thing might interfere with that a little bit. And again, because we were talking about like who could win the Heisman. Well, Shador Sanders would not be a wild pick to somehow make his way in there. The problem is the Marshall Faulk question: how's the rest of the team going to look? Will they have just a stunning player who is unfortunately playing with, in his case, a father who has creative ways of building a roster. So, who knows? Who knows? We're not going to presume to bet that in the preseason that they're going to make it all the way. But yeah, I went with Will Johnson on that. Now, let's wrap up here with Coach of the Year. This is always a fun one because we usually see coaches who kind of tend to not necessarily fulfill expectations, although to some extent, but usually they're the coaches who surprise. Where do you think we'd go here?
So I went safe with this. I went with Kyle Whittingham. I think if they're able to kind of convincingly be the top team in the Big 12, he's going to have a really straightforward shot. But and I want to be clear, that's my official pick. That's the one that I made over at CBSSports.com. But I think that in hindsight, I'm being a coward. Like, if they're the number 4 team, I know it doesn't sound good. It doesn't feel good to say out loud. But if they're the number 4 seed, like, it's got to be Mario Cristobal, right? Like, if they're able to be the kind of team that we expect that they can be, they're preseason number 19, but we picked them as number 4 in the country. I think that, like, I just have to suck it up and say it out loud. Mario Cristobal is the coach of the year. And now one other coach I'll say my other ACC team as well. If Dave Doran's able to get this team to 11 wins and on the doorstep of the playoff, I think he also has a really good shot of doing that. But I look up and down my list of playoff teams, the vast majority should expect to be there. Like, I mean, if Ole Miss is number 5, I think, sure, maybe there's a conversation for Lane. But if they're number 9, like I have them, I'm not giving Coach of the Year to Lane for doing what was expected of him, right? Like, I just don't know that there's a coach who jumps off the board. The issue would also be, though, if NC State's like number 12 or 13 and just missed the playoff. Well, I think they started number 23, and that would be a nice jump, but it wouldn't be like a crazy everybody's freaking out jump. Whereas Miami going from number 19 to number 4 or the 4th seed in the college football playoff probably gets a bit more attention. So, all right, I'll do it. It's Mario Cristobal getting an award for coaching.
But I have to say I do like that Doran selection if NC State gets that far. But I think again, I didn't pick them to make it particularly far. I think because of the upset. By the way, if Kyle Whittingham worked, it's crazy. He's never. I don't think he's won the award before the national one, and that's because of his predecessor, Urban Meyer. He's the one who made the big splash. In 2003, he got it, and following the foundation, and it's not like he's been there for 20 years. You can't say that he's riding Urban Meyer's coattails or anything at this point. But I mean, I think he's just people now have gotten used to Utah being so good.
Yeah, I think he did win one Coach of the Year.
Which one though? That's a problem. Is there's like 3 or 4 of them. That's where it gets
actually
kind of
no. He was like he won AFCA and Bear Bryant's Coach of the Year in 2008. So like he was kind of the consensus guy in 2008, but like that's 15 years ago. The other thing, and he did win Bobby Dodd Coach of the Year in 2019, which actually I think was not one of his conference title seasons, which is kind of funny to think about. One of the things that I think kind of held him back a little bit is that both of their Pac-12 title runs were like in their own ways kind of unexpected. Like they didn't really happen the way that people expected. They kind of came from behind in some ways to do it. They weren't like the dominant team from beginning to end. He hasn't had as a power conference coach that kind of year. What I'm projecting is him doing that, right? Is them being a preseason top 10 team, picked number 1 overall in the Big 12 and carrying it all the way through and maybe being a 12-1 team. I think that would be more of a pathway to him winning this kind of award than what he's done over the past 10 years at least.
Well, for my pick, just based on who I had making it through this playoff, I went with the former Missouri Valley football coach of the year, Chris Kleiman at Kansas State.
Always a good pick.
Getting the Wildcats that far, I mean, Bill Snyder will cry a tear of joy to see his Wildcats make it as far as they would in that such a scenario, because he got hosed a few times in the BCS era, and this would be an opportunity to see that. Well, my goodness, we went through a lot of material in this episode, but it was a fun one. The more you write out, the more you kind of think out the way these scenarios could play out, particularly with the conference championships rolling into the 12 seeds. But it is amazing we both came up with the same championship game. We both think it's going to be Ohio State versus Georgia, with Ohio State getting that edge. But yeah, no, it's fascinating to see the way we both came to that kind of conclusion. Well, I think this is a good spot to wrap it up. We want to take too much of your time. Thank you all for sticking around with us and hearing this, and hold our feet to the fire on these predictions, because it is a preseason, and as you know, clearly everything is written. We want to thank all of you for listening to us. I wanted to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure, if you can, like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. We always enjoy having you part of it. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Irie. I'm extremely tired. I've been up for almost 30 hours at this rate, and I'm part of the group that runs Reddit CFP. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Have a good one.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.